So what we want to be able to do now that our ball and our paddle are functional, is to add an AI component to the paddle so that it's possible for the player to play against a computer. So let's go back to the paddle and add some more behaviors. Let's start by adding a timer. We'll set this interval to 0, which means it will refresh as often as it can. Let's actually rename this to AI think. So first, how we want our AI to work is when the ball is moving towards the paddle. If the ball is above the paddle, move up, and if the ball is below the paddle, move down. So first, let's just start by adding a behavior for when it's not allowed to move. In which case, we're going to set this move direction to 0. So we're just getting the input field like before, and we'll set that to 0. Now we want to be able to check if the ball is moving towards the paddle. So let's use the get position on the ball and the paddle. We can actually rename these just for readability. And then we also need to get the velocity of the ball. So now we can start by adding some if statements. So if the ball's x is less than the paddle's x, that means the ball is to the left of the paddle. Let's also add another if statement underneath. Let's check if the ball's velocity is greater than 0. So if the ball is to the left of the paddle and the ball is moving right, that means the ball is moving towards the paddle. We can do the same thing for the other case. So this is if the ball's x position is greater than the paddle's x position. So the ball is to the right of the paddle. We'll add an if here. We want to check if the ball's velocity is less than 0. So this checks if the ball is moving towards the paddle. In which case, let's do a subtract. We just want to get the difference in their x positions. So we'll drag the balls, their y positions. The ball's y, the paddle's y. And this value we'll be using to change. So let's go back to move direction. We'll get an input field. And we can use that subtract value. So now if we play, the paddle moves when the ball is moving towards it, and it moves to intercept the ball. Our AI is pretty good. Actually, it's really good. It's a little OP, and we want to be able to give the player a decent chance at winning. So we're going to add some randomness or some entropy to the AI. So let's go back. Let's disconnect right after this subtract here. And let's put an add. We'll add our previous value, and we'll add a box container, which we can rename to entropy. We'll set this default value to 0. And we'll use this new value there. So this entropy is a random value that will make the AI a little more human-like and a little less perfect. So to get that entropy value, what we can do is first detect a collision between a ball and another object. This is because we want the entropy to be constantly changing. So when we detect a collision, we're changing the entropy value. We can do that by getting the velocity of the ball and then we're also going to do a subtract. So let's get the negative velocity of the ball, so that's 0 minus our velocity. I should know this is our y velocity. And then we can add a random number here. Which is between our velocity and that negative velocity we calculated. And then this random number is actually going to be a little big, which is a little too much randomness. So we can divide by some number. We can just do 5, I guess. You can change this number and then therefore change the difficulty of the AI. So if you wanted to incorporate like different levels of difficulty in your game, you could do that. But I think this is good for now. Let's go to that entropy we had earlier. Let's get a change input field and then change the input field with that value we just calculated. So now we have entropy adding a little randomness to our AI. Let's test that. Okay, as you can see, we started off with a 0 value. Let's actually try that again. So as you can see, the AI is a little less perfect. The ball isn't always hitting directly in the center of the paddle, and this gives the human a decent chance of winning. Now that we have our AI functional, let's start by adding a second player. And then we can have different player modes as well. So let's go back. And what we're going to do is, let's first go to global UI mode. And we're going to create a label. This is just going to store our game settings. So we can call this game settings. And then we can go to the attributes tab. Let's create an attribute player1 AI. Let's also create an attribute player2 AI. We can set the player1 AI to 0 and the player2 AI to 1. So what this means is that the player1 is a human and player2 is a computer. So let's actually detect that in the paddle behaviors. We'll go back to the main view, behaviors. So first, we need to be able to get that attribute value. So we'll drag a get attribute in. Get attribute of game settings. And we want to get the player1 AI. And then we can put some if statements in. So we want to check if our attribute value is equal to 0. 0 means human. Human means we don't need this AI think behavior, so we can turn that off. We'll turn off AI think. And then the other case is if we are an AI. So let's test if that attribute value is equal to 1. If we are an AI, what we want to do is disable the joysticks. So those 2 joystick behaviors from earlier, we're going to disable those. So let's do behavior off. We need 2 of them. What are they called? Joystick analog and stopped touching. Also, what we should do is just hide that graphic since we're not using the joysticks anymore. So we'll do hide graphic. And we'll select the joystick. And since we're hiding the graphic for AI, then we should be showing the graphic for human. Alright, so now that we have that, we can actually create our second player. So we can just duplicate that paddle. Let's put grid mode on. Duplicate. We'll just move that over. It's already called player 2 for us. And what we should also do is duplicate this joystick. And then the only thing we have to do is change a few names in the player 2 object. So for example, the attribute should be getting player 2 AI. The graphic should be that right joystick. Same here. Select that right joystick. And also same in that move direction. Just make sure the right joystick is selected. So now if we play, we should have on the left a human player and on the right an AI player. So now that we have different player modes available, we should actually make these options in the main menu. So let's go back to the main menu scene we created first. We have our title. Let's create a label. We'll call this one player mode. Let's just set the text color to white, alignment, center. Okay, cool. Let's add a behavior. When we tap that text, we should change the mode. Therefore, we need a started touching behavior. So when you tap that text, we want to set that game settings attribute. So let's go to set attribute. This is game settings. And we're setting player 1 AI, so one player mode. Player 1 AI is human, so that's a 0. And then also, for setting player 1 to human, we need to set player 2 to AI, so that's a 1. And then, once we finish setting our options, we should actually load the game. So we can just go to load scene, and then select that game scene. You can put like a transition here. Let's do crossfade. And then if you go back and you click play, you click that one player mode, we're now in one player mode. Now that that's working, let's actually do that for the other modes as well. So just make sure we're in main. We're going to duplicate that. So we'll have a two-player mode. Two-player mode means player 1 is 0, human. Player 2 is 0, human. And then our last mode would be like a watch AI mode, so 2 AIs. So that means player 1 is AI, player 2 AI. So now if we test, we can watch 2 computers play Pong. Very cool.